Okay, so welcome back. We're here at part two, which is weed prevention. And in this part of the training, we're going to talk about preventing weeds, which is basically keeping them from getting into the landscape in the first place. Weeds can come into the landscape and be introduced from many different sources. So limiting the introduction of weeds, at least as much as possible, is going to help us much more than trying to control the weeds once they're already there. And so that's going to be the focus of part two of this training. So don't introduce weeds. That's going to be hard to do, easier said than done. But once you know where the weeds are coming from, you can at least limit the introduction of new weeds and stop them from spreading, or do the best job that you can. Once weeds are in the landscape, they're going to be very hard to control. The old saying is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of the cure. And that holds very true when it comes to weed management. In the case of weeds, you could say that an ounce of prevention is worth a season of yanking or hand pulling weeds out of the turf or a landscape bed. I mean, much easier to prevent them than to control them once they're already there. Along these same lines, remember that weed infestations don't usually get worse on a linear scale. They get worse on an exponential scale. So for example, a single spurge plant can produce about 6,000 seed in about 8 or 10 weeks. Research has shown this. So these seeds are going to be 80 to 90% viable once they reach maturity. And then as soon as those seeds are mature on that plant, they can be immediately viable, meaning that as soon as they come off the plant, land in the soil, they have the ability to germinate. They don't have any sort of dormancy requirement. So most of those seed are going to germinate and grow. So think about it, 80 to 90% of 6,000 seed, those seedlings will produce 6,000 seed if they were allowed to grow. 80 to 90% of that second generation is going to be viable, and so on and so forth. So you can see how a small problem could become a very big problem very quickly, and how weeds can spread exponentially. So now let's talk about where the seeds are coming in from in the first place. Seeds can be introduced in soil amendments like compost or mulch. This is especially true when we use mulch like yard clippings or leaves, which could contain a lot of weed seeds. Those mulch types are great for plant health, but in a lot of cases they can contain weed seeds if we use those as our primary mulch. There are also many seeds that are already in the soil, and that's what we call the soil seed bank. Thousands of seed are lying dormant in the soil, and they haven't germinated because the conditions aren't quite right for them to germinate, or they might be too deep in the soil profile to germinate. As soon as that soil is disturbed and those seeds are exposed to light or moisture, or the conditions are right, that environment or weather might change, and then those seeds can start to germinate. Some species can have seeds that are dormant for decades, and so really you can see how over time that seed bank can really increase exponentially, and there can be a lot of seed lying dormant in the soil. So anytime we disturb the soil, we have a chance of having weed seeds that start to germinate, and that's usually going to be the case. Seeds can also come in on contaminated equipment. So a major way that weeds are spread is on things like lawn equipment or mowers, or things like string trimmers or weed eaters. So some lawn companies may mow several lawns and not have time to blow off their equipment between one lawn and the next. And so what one lawn has in terms of weeds, other lawns will have it, the lawns that they visit after that. In some cases, people may have more weeds in their backyard compared to their front yard. And that might be because they spend more time and resources keeping their front yard looking nice, and the backyard is kind of an afterthought, and they'll kind of let the weeds get a little bit out of control back there, or they just don't spend the time keeping those areas as clean as they would the more visible front yard. And so if you are doing your lawn maintenance yourself, it will be important to clean off that equipment before you went from a backyard or the weedy area into the cleaner area, to prevent spreading weed seed throughout your own landscape as well. Weeds can also come in with potted plants or in grass seed. Weed control in nurseries is very difficult. That's part of my job responsibilities. And oftentimes potted plants are going to contain some weeds or some weed seeds. And so it's important when you get those potted plants to remove those weeds before you plant to keep those weeds from spreading. You can also limit weed introductions in grass seed by choosing seed that has very low weed percentages. The percentage of the grass seed and the weed seed should be listed on the package. And all grass seed will usually contain at least some amount of weed seed, but purchasing quality seed from good reputable companies is going to help limit the weeds that are introduced in grass seed or other seeds that you might plant. Another big way that weeds are spread is by animals or people. In this slide, you can see some beggar's ticks. Those are also known as Spanish needles on someone's pants. So some weeds like beggar ticks have seeds that will stick on clothing or animal fur, and then those weeds would use that ability of those seeds to stick on that as a dispersal mechanism. In some cases, birds or other animals might eat seed and can spread them that way as well. So if you've ever driven down the highway, especially maybe down in South Florida, and seen a lot of Brazilian pepper trees or some other type of invasive trees growing from underneath a power line, the seeds might have been moved there by birds. Birds will eat the seed and they go and sit on the power line, and we'll just say they naturally disperse the seeds over time while they're sitting up there on the power lines. Probably the most common way that weeds are introduced is naturally through wind, and then sometimes also by water. A lot of weeds have wind-borne seed that can blow for miles until they find a nice little spot to germinate, which might just be your flower garden. It's fairly common for people to see strange new weeds that they might not have seen in the past after big storms or hurricanes and things like that, because seed can move for far distances. Water can also move seeds. Seeds might float, or they can be splashed around by rainfall or irrigation. So we might see seeds move in or be introduced that way as well. So there's a lot of different ways that seeds and weeds can spread. And for things like wind dispersal, there isn't a whole lot that we can do if the seeds are coming in from far away. But keeping the weeds down and in control in your own landscape is the best that we can really do, and that's going to really help keep those weeds in check and at a manageable level. So we've talked about weed identification and the different weed types and how to prevent them. Before we get too deep in the weeds in terms of managing weeds, it's important to remember that weeds are going to be opportunists. I like to describe weeds as secondary invaders, and they usually start to cause problems when something else is just not quite right, and there's probably an underlying problem, and the weeds might be more of a symptom of that problem as opposed to the problem themselves. So for an example, let's say the turf is thinning and because it's getting too much shade, or maybe you just picked the wrong type of turf for a particular site. Perhaps the pH is too high for a particular turf grass that you used. And so that turf is going to be a lot more prone to getting infested with weeds because it's just not going to be healthy. It's getting too much shade, or it's not the best turf for that area, and that turf is never going to be able to really grow in thick and nice and be able to outcompete the weeds. Similarly, if you over-irrigate, the turf could also struggle with some disease issues, and weeds could take over that way. If other diseases or insects weaken the turf, something like chinch bugs, that's another chance for weeds to start coming in. Nature hates a void, and weeds will always fill that void. No matter what kind of situation or environment that we create, whether it be sunny or shady or wet or dry, there's going to be a weed species that's going to be able to thrive under that condition. So what can we do? First, remember that the first rule of landscape design is to pick the right plant for the right place. The healthier that the plants in the turf is, the better they're going to be able to fend off the weeds. So how do we do that? I would say follow the IFAS guidelines for cultural practices for your turf grass and then for the landscape plants by doing things like properly fertilizing, properly pruning, and managing other pests in a responsible way. Controlling foot traffic is another important factor. Those weeds that like compaction can come into those cases where we have a lot of foot traffic that's not diverted. So the best offense against weeds is a good defense, and the best way that we can have a good defense is by having our turf and landscape plants be as healthy as possible.